Welcome back, and while the men are lining up, let's meet the riders.
The most famous mountain biker in the world. In 1991, John was cross-country gold medalist, downhill silver medalist and the World Cup winner. He was second last year.
Thomas has been 3-time silver medalist at the Worlds, as well as winner of the Cyclocross World Championship. He was the 1992 World Cup winner.
The reigning mountain bike and amateur cyclocross world champion, Henrik is one of the most tactical riders in the sport.
World Cup champion in 1990 and a former amateur and professional cyclocross world champion, Mike is a showman who's often brilliant, but you can never be sure when.
Gerhard is the only rider to have won World Cup races on and off-road. One of the few riders on the circuit to have also ridden the Tour de France.
Tinker was 9th at last year's World Championships, despite not being on the American team. He's a strong climber, usually in the big ring, but his lack of consistency lets him down.
Leading the British attack, David is the national champion and was bronze medalist at last year's World Championships. His best result in the World Cup was a third last year.
Another former World Championship bronze medalist, Tim is possibly the best climber in the world. Has beaten everyone, but is still recovering from illness.
In only his second year of mountain biking, Gary was runner-up in the National Championships a fortnight ago. With a background on the road, he has the strength but may lack the technique.
Barry is a former king of the mountains in the milk race, and with 2 top 10 results in the World Cup last year, is beginning to shine on the international stage.
After the previous 8 rounds, Thomas comfortably leads the series, and the real battle is for the final podium places. A good result here could see Gary move up to second and be enough for either Barry or Tim to move into the top 10.
So the men's competition is much closer than the women's, and though Thomas Frischknecht is comfortably leading the series, he hasn't stamped his authority on every race. Charging through the river, Mike Kluger went straight to the front, but also up there was Gary Ford, Barry Clark, Tim Gould, and further down David Baker, who hasn't been competing in the series, so he had to do a qualifying race the day before and was gridded behind the top 50 seeded riders. Up the first climb, the 1990 world champion Ned Overend led ahead of Barry Clark, Mike Kluger, Gary Ford and John Tomac. By the bottom of the pipeline, the Swiss rider Bert Wabel was leading, but Tomac was keeping the crowd happy as he charged through to second ahead of Kluger and Ford. Behind it was just clouds of dust. By the time the field was into the clear air of the moors, Gary Ford had got to the front and was setting about opening a gap on Kluger, Tomac, Don Myra, Wabel and Tinker Juarez, a sign of his growing confidence. The second group was led by the Norwegian Rune Højdal and contained the world champion Henrik Dernese as well as Frischknecht. While in the third group, David Baker was gradually making his way up through the field. Joining the race leaders on the way back down, and only Tomac had been able to bridge the gap to Ford as they started descending off of Dartmoor. They were beginning to open a useful gap, being just out of sight of lone chaser Mike Kluger. Approaching the third river crossing, and Tomac had not been able, or not tried, to get past Ford as they flew along the single track. Kluger looked like he had returned to form ahead of the chasing group of 4, Myra, Wabel, Overend and Juarez. In the next group, Barry Clark was ahead of Dernese, Frischknecht, Gerhard Zadrobilek and the third British rider, Nick Craig. Onto lap 2 and climbing up to the bomb holes, Ford was still setting a fast pace, and it was all Tomac could do just to sit in with him. Meanwhile, Mike Kluger had to drop out with a broken saddle. The Austrian, Kurt Popsigal, had joined the chasing pack. And then came something else for the crowd to cheer. David Baker in 9th, leading a group of 4 that also contained Craig and Clark, and all 3 were ahead of Dernese and Frischknecht. Further down, Tim Davies, who looked like he was having one of his best rides this season, made it 5 Brits in the top 22. But that wasn't the way for long, as ahead of him Clark was off his bike and doing some trackside repairs. He had buckled his rim and was desperately trying to get his front wheel off to fix it. As other riders passed him, they probably had a moment's pity for Barry and then gratefully moved up a place. Tim Gould there going through in 28th place. After a couple of minutes, it seemed as though Clark had fixed it, reinflated his tyre and was back on his way. But his wheel was still jammed, and after a few more attempts to fix it, he had to retire.
In a sport where it's not unusual to be carrying your bike, and there's a lot of going up, mountain bikers crave lightweight equipment. But if taken to the extreme, particularly with wheels and tyres, riders risk costly time delays or even retirement, since unlike road racing, no outside assistance is allowed, so if it breaks, you're on your own. As a precaution, riders carry a first aid kit for their bikes. This usually contains spare tubes, gas canisters for rapid inflation and a chain splitter. And if that doesn't sort you out, well, who needs a tyre anyway?
Back with the lead riders on the moor, and Ned Overend had joined Ford and Tomac up front. But once they started climbing at the far end of the course, Ford yet again began to open a gap on the following pair. Though behind them, the gap was coming down as Don Myra led the chase, with David Baker now up into 5th. And remember, he started at about 60th on the grid. Approaching the end of the lap, and the lead 3 were back together as Tomac attacked on the long, fast descent, while David Baker was now making a solo attempt to bridge the gap in 4th. Rejoining the leaders at the bomb holes on lap 3, Ford and Overend had been able to withstand the Tomac attack, and now Baker was on the tail of the group. Wherever possible, Tomac would go to the front for the technical sections to ensure a clear run at them, much to the crowd's enjoyment, but he was never able to make a break. Behind, Don Myra and Jan Vijek were leading the chase, but they were nearly a minute down and the gap was gradually opening, though Frischknecht was close behind and now looking capable of starting to move up the field. As the lead 4 began descending from the top of the course, Overend had upped the pace. Sitting closely on his wheel, Tomac hit a rock, and as the riders re-emerged from one of the dips, Tomac was missing, presumed punctured. If Overend had been aware of what was happening behind, he may have decided to attack then. As it was, Baker and Ford quickly closed the gap. Baker all the while was trying to conserve energy, having worked so hard just to get up there. Meanwhile, Tomac set about fixing his puncture. Myra and Vijak were the first of about 10 riders to pass him. So by the third river crossing, the lead group was down to 3, whilst the chasers were also splitting up, with both Jan Vijak and Thomas Frischknecht moving ahead of Don Myra. As the leaders climbed again, there was support all round the course for the Brits, and they needed it, as Ned Overend once again upped the tempo and made them suffer. Further down the field, Nick Craig had moved up to 11th, ahead of Gerhard Zadrabilek, and behind them, Tomac was charging again. Fourth Brit was Tim Davis in 14th. As they start the final lap, Overend's attack had done half of its job. Baker was still with him, but for the first time in the race, Ford was off the pace by 30 seconds. And as the lead 2 headed down the pipeline, the crowd were beginning to think that a home win was possible, while Gary Ford had to hope that Overend would tire after his relentless push for the previous half lap. Back on the climb, his teammate Jan Vijak looked comfortable in 4th, but over a minute down on the leaders, he had little chance of making the podium, while Frischknecht now had company in 5th with Bart Brent Jens. And by the bottom of the pipeline, the Dutch rider had started to move away from the series leader. Don Myra was gradually sliding down the field as Peter Rich now closed in on him, but closing with a star that could only belong to one man. John Tomac was now back into 9th, with Myra and Rich his next targets. Into the second river crossing, and Baker was presented with the opportunity he needed as the tiring Overend slipped and got a complete drenching. Baker didn't have to be asked twice, he did as the crowd bid him and attacked. Ford, meanwhile, was getting a second wind and would shortly see Overend ahead of him from the other side of the river. By the top of the moor, Baker had the gap he wanted and now could just ride for himself, while Overend was having to turn his attention backwards and watch out for the rejuvenated Ford. As David headed down the wooded single track, he only had to ensure he didn't have any problems to win. He now had a minute's lead on Overend, who had been let off the hook when the unlucky Ford broke his chain on the way down from the moors, leaving the final podium spot to be contested by Vjak and, guess who? Tomac. But that was of no concern to Baker, as he headed in for his first ever World Cup win and an amazing reception from the crowd.
2 hours, 31 minutes and 7 seconds. An absolutely spectacular ride from the UK.
Behind him, a very tired Ned Overend took second, with his best ride this year, and Tomac took third, passing Vjak on the final descent.
Well, I knew that I had to go hard fairly early on to get up to the leaders, because once they got a big gap, then there was no way of closing it. So I had to fight really hard early on.
Did you sense that Ned and Gary were failing on the third lap?
Not particularly. Like I was struggling probably more than anybody because of the qualifying race yesterday. So I was just like sitting on the bike really by right. But that's the way I should do because I had to race yesterday.
So in the end, Baker won by over a minute, with Tim Davis 10th and Nick Craig 14th.
Well, that brings to an end the British mountain bike season. But join us next week to see how Matt, Caroline, David and the rest of our top riders fare at the World Championships in France.